Hi, I'm Ella Spencer. This is a schmooze day, which of course means that we don't have an agenda. And what I like to do is invite some friends in who don't know each other and just introduce them to each other and say, what is on your mind? I guess, Waterloo or Kitchener, I never know where these people are, is Alistair Edgar, who's a professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, or whatever the proper title is. And he's done work in Russia. He's very familiar with peacekeeping work, and I think he teaches peace studies mostly. And in London, Ontario, at the University is Western Ontario, is Professor Erica Simpson, who's a professor of international relations at Western. And her special bag is NATO. And here in Toronto, I believe, at his bakery, is Boris Rishishevsky, who is a former member of parliament, I think more than once, as a liberal. And he's the owner of a big bakery operation. And back in the day, when there were lots and lots of Ukrainians coming through, seeing the world as young people, they would come, and half of them would stay with me, and they would go to Boris for a job, and he'd always have a job at his bakery. So good morning, Boris. How are you?
Under the circumstances, fine. Thank you, Meta.
Are you still in your bakery?
Yes. I'm back to my roots, nourishing people. Proud of it, a third-generation baker. But as you mentioned, I did have 4 terms. It was 4 as a member of parliament. And interestingly, when I completed my 4th term and announced that I would not be running again, I felt I had done my public service. My last legislative act was the establishment of a department for women, peace, and security. And as recently, I guess it was last Tuesday, I spoke with the ambassador, Ambassador O'Neill, in regards to a concept for a project that I had a number of years ago. In that last term, I chaired the parliamentary committee for NATO. And that's a joint committee of parliament of both the House and the Senate. So I'm somewhat familiar with both topics. I've done a lot of visiting of NATO countries, and in my peace work, visited places in the past, such as Darfur during the genocide there, and a lot of that work has informed some of my legislative initiatives in the House when I was there.
I was very interested to hear that you were on the parliamentary committee, and I'm wondering whether you knew the Canadian Senator Joseph Day, who was the one that revealed the exact location of NATO's tactical, you want to call them tactical, short-range nuclear bombs. So the ones in Italy, Belgium, Germany, and Turkey. He revealed the exact locations in a parliamentary report.
I know Senator Day quite well, and but I did not know, and I'm just wondering when that might have occurred, because that most likely did not occur when I was chairing the parliamentary committee.
But it's important to know that classified information is out there now. And so that means that those weapons are soft targets in the long-term future for Russia, or for the greatest risk, of course, is Turkey. And if Turkey was to be taken over, then they would know exactly where those bombs are. And so we saw with the Russian forces taking over Chernobyl and then attacking the largest reactor in Europe in the south. So could something similar now happen with NATO's tactical nuclear weapons? You must have been briefed on that.
Nope. So the best person to ask about that would have been Senator Day.
Mhm.
I assume most of the reports that were written, although parliamentarians, including senators, and senators, as we all know, have a lot more time on their hands than MPs. So senators tended to take a lot more initiative, I'll put it that way, in preparing reports. And in this case, it would have been, I assume, for the Parliamentary Assembly. For it to be published, it would have been received and read. So it would be peculiar for something that was top secret in nature for it to slip past, unless this was something that Senator Day wrote and posted on his own, as opposed to NATO websites.
I did just look it up, and he revealed that information in 2019.
If that occurred in 2019, it also depends when, because once you announce that you are not running, and once the writ period begins, you no longer have access as an MP, although you continue with your riding duties. You no longer have access to all those materials.
I think we're all going to agree that the roots of the Russian dissatisfaction with NATO go back to the early 2000s when you were a member of parliament. So if we want to understand the solution, we have to understand the hostility that Russia felt about NATO expansion, and particularly the risks of short-range nuclear weapons in Europe. This is a huge issue.
So I would beg to differ that, see, we're falling into the trap of Putin's framing of the debate. And the debate is a reflection of Putin's strategy of trying to frame this as a debate around NATO. But if you carefully read his statements where he talks about his thinking, not when he strategically in press conferences or in speeches before Western audiences tries to frame the debate or his tactics, when he actually talks about his vision, it goes back to Tsarist times. And his obsession, especially in these sort of late stages of his presidency, is Novorossiya. If you look at his speeches, especially where he gets emotional, he talks about Kyiv. He used to sometimes also talk about Crimea, but he figures he's resolved that particular one. So we need to look at what his obsessions are, and it's very useful for him to frame the discussion around NATO expansion. And that's not a real debate. Initially, there were people in the West and Western politicians thought that at some point in time, as Russia progressed, when Russia was a nascent democracy, that Russia would become part of our North Atlantic democratic zone.
Russia was invited onto Partnership for Peace, and they did participate with the UN and with NATO in peacekeeping, as Alistair knows. So I'm not trying to defend Russia, nor am I trying to defend Putin. I'm just saying that NATO expansion is a significant factor that is part of his thinking and Russian thinking overall. All Russian leaders have been against, Yeltsin and so on, have been against NATO expansion. So the West has to look a little bit at our actions and what we've done in terms of deployments of tactical nuclear weapons on Russia's borders. But I'm just curious what Alistair and Dr. Spencer think too.
In the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, I was just a PhD student at the time, but I spent a bunch of time because of my research actually at NATO headquarters with the international staff around the Directorate of Armaments Cooperation, but also got to participate in some of the internal, this isn't the political, this is the international staff, discussions about the end of the Soviet Union and about, at that time, the number of former Soviet republics, the number of former countries that formerly had been occupied by Russia as well, by the Soviet Union, I should say, about them seeking NATO membership. And at the inside of that part of NATO, there was a great deal of uncertainty. Sometimes when people talk about NATO, they think, you know, it's a huge plot and there's clearly a big organization doing a lot of stuff. At that time, the NATO international staff, at least, felt very small, extremely overworked, completely confused, anxious. And part of that was because a lot of countries that had been part of the Soviet Union were knocking on NATO's door, saying, we've had enough of being occupied, now we're independent, or we're hoping to move further away from Russia. It was interesting. I had that experience on that side, where the dynamic, if you will, was from countries wanting to join Russia. And the big concern, the big uncertainty in that debate was, at that time, what would we do if Ukraine asks to join, because it's so close by? Mm-hmm. I also then used to take, and this is in the mid-90s, mostly when Yeltsin was in power, I took a lot of Canadian students to Moscow State University, and actually to Kiev as well, to do courses on Russian foreign policy, Russian history and Russian foreign policy. And the view from MGU was that for them at that time, Ukraine wasn't foreign policy. Ukraine was near abroad. They talked about out there and near abroad. And what I mean by that, in part, is they actually still, and these were moderates at MGU at that time, they still saw Ukraine as part of Russia. I'm not defending that view. They still saw it as, it's not another country. And that might feed in a little bit to this notion that Putin has never accepted that Ukraine didn't belong to him. So he's always been ready, willing, and waiting for an opportunity to be able to take it back. Irrespective of NATO, it was not seen as being a country of its own, you know. So I've had those interesting, almost flashbacks in the current context of seeing what's going on there. So that's part of something. I'll be happy to come back to talk about the UN, because the things that occupy my mind, why the heck hasn't Guterres been more involved? Well, now he is at least trying to be more involved, but what role has the UN failed to play? What role has it played? What role can it play? Why
don't you go? Feel free to speculate on that now, because all of this is one big puzzle. You know, who's responsible? I'm afraid that we spend maybe too much time, if anything, talking about whom should be blamed the most, you know, and not enough time thinking about, well, never mind how we got here. The question is, how do we get out of this? And because that's a lot harder problem. You can spend a lot of time talking about how it all happened, But really, and we certainly need to know that, because there have been plenty of mistakes enough to go around. Everybody's done some really stupid things, but how peace activists can propose solutions that would be the least bit helpful right now is, I think, the biggest problem of all. But at any rate, we have to look at the whole big complex together, what the UN did and didn't do and couldn't do and should have done, and how come we seem to not talk about the former Soviet republics as dynamic actors in the course of events. In other words, I think it wasn't just that Bill Clinton out of the blue said, well, yes, we're going to let all of these countries in, and tried to persuade Yeltsin to like the idea, but he was being pushed by the countries that wanted in so much. I remember being in Prague just shortly after the Velvet Revolution, and seeing people who had become sort of friends of mine, who'd been dissidents and democracy activists back in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia before the wall or before the Velvet Revolution. And here they were just clamoring to get into NATO. And I stood up and I remember, I thought I knew you guys. Who the hell are you? What are you talking about? You want in NATO? But they sure did right then, immediately, right off the bat. And that was not an insignificant dynamic. The demand to be admitted, they had a moral claim, and you could see it their way for sure, that they, if they wanted in, what right would anybody have to say no? Well, anyway, so I'm talking too much. But Alistair, if you want to elaborate on this thing about the UN, because I'm a little, I guess we're all a little puzzled about why it has not been more assertive in this situation.
Sure. There's when I talk to people about the UN, I always say, which one? What I mean there is the political UN, which is the General Assembly, the UN of member states, and then the UN of the Secretariat, which would be, Guterres, and then, if you want, the permanent International Civil Service of the UN. And so one thing we hear is, well, has the Security Council failed? Well, that's the political UN, and I'll put that one to one side, because nobody who pays any attention to the UN should ever expect the Security Council to be able to do something when it involves one of the P5. It can't. So we can, put that up as a straw man to beat, but it can't do that. And probably you don't want it to. Would you really want the Security Council to say Russia has illegally invaded Ukraine and now we must have a Chapter 7 use of force against Russia, because that's world war? So probably we don't want the Security Council to do those things. And it's not designed to be able to. The disappointment for me up till now has been Guterres, the Secretary General, not taking a leading role early in this, when this was a crisis, not a war, early in this crisis, not being vocal, not being central, and not going to, and the Russians were quite dismissive of him back then, but not going to Moscow at that time when Russian forces were massing on the border. So I think I like him, but he's been a disappointment in this context. He has not been active. He has not been a voice the way that, maybe Kofi Annan might have been a voice, for example. But I think he has lost an opportunity up to this point. And now both sides are, it's a war. And now both sides are deeply embedded in this. And I don't know what he can do. He can't go and parlay peace with Moscow. So it's difficult to see what he's going to do, but at least he's there. The other parts of the UN system, I think, actually have, and I was on a call earlier this morning on the same topic. I think they've actually done what we might expect them to do. The humanitarian aid agencies on the ground have responded right across Ukraine. the General Assembly, with the Security Council being paralyzed, took on its Uniting for Peace, moved the debate down there, did their vote, 141, 142 to condemn the Russian invasion, and 5 against, abstentions too, but 141 or 2 against 5. The ejection from the Human Rights Council, the case brought to the International Court of Justice, and now the ICC outside of the UN system doing its investigations. So I think all those parts of the UN system are doing a good job in bad circumstances. So the no surprise for me is the Security Council. The disappointment up to now has been the Secretary General. The other parts of the UN system, I think, have functioned the way that they should.
Okay.
Actually, I fully agree with Alistair with your assessment there. And it's interesting because I was down at the UN the week of the invasion. And I have to mention our ambassador, Bob Ray, probably gave the best speech in the General Assembly the day before the invasion took place. And the General Secretary gave a speech as well. It was a great speech. But then the question is, okay, you've given a great speech. What are you doing about it? Which comes right back to your question, the activism. He's not an activist General Secretary. And it's late in the game. Because even that week was very late in the game. We knew ahead of time. And anyone, if you're the General Secretary, part of your assessments should be, and since peacekeeping is such an important part of how people understand the role of NATO, you must have assessments of various hotspots around the world where there may be war, a potential for crimes against humanity, genocide in particular. And it was quite clear from when President Putin put out his essay on the Kremlin's website back in July of last summer, that if you read that essay, it was incredibly unnerving. And you have to understand Kremlin political culture as you read it, and overlaid with Putin's sort of KGB background. It was quite clear. I remember reading it, and I just couldn't get to sleep that night because it was clear to me the intent was the eradication of not just the Ukrainian state, but of the Ukrainian people. So we were talking about genocide. So the General Secretary had to have been aware, if not last summer, through the fall, and through January, yet you're quite right, we didn't see any action. As a Canadian, I'm quite proud of Canada's input in the whole concept of responsibility to protect. Now we're past the point of where we can intervene in a way, although there might still be some potentials, but he could have played such an important role, and the UN would have been seen as playing an important role back in the fall and through the winter, definitely. So you're quite right. We'll see what his upcoming meetings, what they end up producing, and of course, we certainly hope that the ICC, the fact that they're studying this as it happens, that perhaps it might have an impact on some of the decision making that's currently being arrived at.
Really? Why do you think it might? They were really stellar. I watched the proceedings as they talked about what they thought of Putin's operations, but it was completely ignored. I mean, what enforcement mechanism is there? And in fact, if you want to go back even farther, Boris, you can say, well, it wasn't just at the beginning of the encirclement of Ukraine. It goes back to, when they attacked, the thing in Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia and all of these other places where you've got little green men doing strange things. You wonder why we were so oblivious even then to the intentions that were being pretty apparent to anybody who wanted to see it. Why didn't we do something then? Well, I don't know why we didn't, but I wouldn't have known what to do in the first place. That's the problem. Even now, I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. So here's because you've referenced it historically, but currently what's happening. So I'll give you just an example. So in Bucha, you have French investigators, a very large group of French investigators. You have investigators doing different parts of the ICC's investigation in Ukraine, designated for to do different parts of this investigation. That gets some coverage back in France. And what that comes back to is public opinion, and where public opinion is as they watch events unfold. And what's fascinating, politicians are often behind the curve with public opinion. That's why they hire these polling companies to try to give them some insight into this. I've never seen, and I had the opportunity to share some public opinion polls. I think it was towards the end of January, beginning of February, from the European Union with our foreign affairs minister, because we were having a conversation. And I said, you realize that your colleagues that you're meeting with in Europe are way behind behind where public opinion sits on Ukraine. Even France, at that point, a majority of the French supported Ukraine's entry into NATO, which is astounding because we don't think of them in that way. But coming back to Canada, we've seen numbers that and as a former politician, politicians always look at all these polls. It's rare that non-economic issues are of primary concern for Canadians in opinion polling. Yet, for weeks and weeks, we saw Ukraine and being the primary issue, and it was in the 70s in terms of percentiles of providing lethal weapons, and we're talking about Canadians providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. The politicians in Canada and other countries were way behind and continue to be behind. So that's why, for instance, the ICC's work now, it doesn't get quite the sort of media that the atrocities that we see almost on a daily basis gets, but that also helps frame public opinion and the whole concept of justice and how do we prevent this from happening again. You'd mentioned Abkhazia and Georgia. That never registered in public opinion. If you asked someone, where is Abkhazia or South Ossetia? So people like ourselves who are immersed in this, of course, but for the average person, it wouldn't register. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm hopeful that work that the ICC is doing will have an opinion impact, but it's on the opinion which then helps push our elected leaders to make those very difficult decisions. And we've unfortunately, and it comes back, Meta, to your whole issue about South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These sequential attempts at resets with the Kremlin. We just don't understand Kremlin political culture in the West. We're products of a very different political culture. It's alien to us. It might as well be from a different planet. It's that different. And I remember sitting at tables with colleagues with Russian delegations on the opposite side, and I would watch. And, I'd sit there and watch and look at their professionalism. They remind me of tennis pros, just, the questions put from Western colleagues to them and the way they'd handle it, because these were, unlike our side, which were mostly elected representatives with not a lot, I hate to say it, but not a lot of background. These were pros. And we didn't know the right questions to ask. And I'd sit there watching this. And so we're at a natural disadvantage because they will not play by our rules. They and this is the biggest threat right now, that in the shattered remains of Ukraine, you will also see the ruins of the post-World War II, as imperfect as it was, but a world that had a system of treaties and accords that prevented world wars, and we're seeing the potential for that to lie in the ruins of Ukraine.
Today, Sunday rather, at the Global Town Hall, there were two people and they agreed. One was in Moscow and the other was in Kyiv. He's an organizer of peace groups based in Kyiv, Andrei Kamenshkov. And both of these guys agreed that the most dangerous time is coming up possibly soon, because they believe that Ukraine is winning the war, and it'll be very evident that there's not much more that Russia can do to win it. I'm not prepared to see it that way yet. And maybe I hope they're right, but I'm not sure, because the downside is when Putin has his back to the wall, has nothing more he can do to win the war, they say that's when he is very likely to use nuclear weapons. And the thing that the foreign minister said yesterday basically confirmed the notion, take this seriously, our nuclear threat is real. Now, so the question that they were posing to all of us is, how can we do anything to influence Putin? Is there any way we could get to Xi and Modi? Because those two guys might have some leverage over his policies, and tell him, don't you dare use a tactical nuclear weapon, not even a tiny, tiny, tiny baby nuclear weapon. And so I think that is something that we have to take into account, especially what Erica said at the beginning, because you frightened me, Erica, when you talked about they know where the nuclear weapons are. Well, maybe they did anyway. I don't know. But, do they still know? Are those nuclear weapons where this fellow said they were? Have they moved them? And what is being taken into account in planning for the eventuality that Putin may be really far gone?
I want to mention, I sort of want to draw together a lot of the different strands that were brought up, if you don't mind, Meta. And yeah. I mean, you just introduced the idea of how do we influence Vladimir Putin? Do we send social communist pariah states? There were 5 states that voted no. There were 141 that voted yes in favor of the UN declaration that Alistair was talking about, and there were 35 abstentions. So to me, the 35 abstentions, India, China, and so on, very indicative of the deeper problems with the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. So Alistair, you were pointing out that the UN Security Council was not the venue to take decisive action. Dag Hammarskjöld, he took decisive action during the previous crises, during the Congo, and Guterres did not take action before this crisis turned into a war. So I agree with you, Alistair. He himself is not a statesman who is a leader. We're looking to statesmen, Meta, because all of the people in this conflict are tending to be men, just like during the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. But Guterres is not a leader that we would need, I think, in a crisis like this. So just to get back to the theme of our previous speaker seems to have disappeared. And he was bringing up the whole problem of public opinion in France and the polls that he had from January. Well, we had the biggest poll ever on Sunday. And on Sunday, we learned that most French voters care deeply about the European Union, and they know about Ukraine. And despite the attraction of Le Pen's crazy ideas, he still resoundingly won, 58% versus 42%. Anyway, she totally lost. So the message there from the French electorate and from French polling is that they strongly believe in the EU. And then I just want to draw in that final point, because he said about Georgia and Ossetia and people didn't pay attention. Yeah, nobody paid attention because Georgia and Ossetia were part of the Russian sphere of influence. But Ukraine was firmly in the middle. It's not a democracy yet, but it was moving toward the West. And NATO was making initiatives toward inviting it in the long run, if there was consensus, to become a NATO ally, to be protected by Article 5. So I think there's not enough institutions and mechanisms in the world. And that's why, Alistair, I really want to know this. Why did Canada not talk about responsibility to protect earlier? Why did we not bring up that idea that resonated so much before? You brought this up too. And I've just been shaking my head. Why did we not have a rapid reaction capability that could have inserted itself? I don't know where, but could have inserted itself. So now the Russians are going to bomb the supply, all these huge long supply lines going to the eastern flank. We're going to for sure have an errant missile that somehow hits Poland. And then NATO is going to be confronted with this huge question. Do we attack and thus lead to possible World War III? Before Madam mentioned I think it's May 8th when Vladimir Putin's going to make the big speech, right? That's when he's stuck in the corner. So I'm concerned that he needs a place to get out. Okay. Yes, Alistair.
Just on R2P, I mean, one thing to keep in mind about R2P, a responsibility to protect for viewers or listeners, is that it's not designed for war between states. Right? It is about internal intrastate conflict. So when a government is unable or unwilling to protect its own people, so when the government is committing mass atrocity crimes, essentially, against its own people and is not willing to stop it, then the international community under R2P may intervene. When that got through the General Assembly as a resolution or declaration in 2005, of course, that resolution said that should go through the Security Council. So it couldn't. But R2P as a doctrine isn't about Russia invading Ukraine and protecting Ukraine from war crimes against humanity, etc. It would be about protecting Ukrainians from the Ukrainian government or Russians from the Russian government.
But I do think I agree with you, Alistair. Yeah, but I think there was essential ideas there about peacekeeping forces, about rapid reaction capability.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, the idea of a rapid
reaction. That was in Montebello in 1995. Canada supported that, and so why did we not take this idea? And like Lester B. Pearson stood up at the UN in 1956. Why has no Canadian leader like Bob Rae stood up and said we need rapid reaction deterrent force in Ukraine, or we need to deploy?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, I guess there. Logistically speaking, and this is me, I'm thinking through it like I was at the Directorate of Armaments Cooperation, but rapid reaction force requires a rapid reaction capability, right? Which means major logistics, major long distance air transport capabilities, advanced units that can move very quickly, et cetera, et cetera. And basically the countries that can do that are going to be NATO countries.
NATO's deployed its rapid reaction capability. 40,000 strong.
But since you, and this stuff, you know this anyway, but since Ukraine wasn't a NATO member, there was no NATO response in Ukraine. And sending it, and if it was not a NATO response, but a UN Rapid Reaction Force response, it still would have been NATO countries sending their militaries into Ukraine to confront a Russian military, which again is that the conflict that we really don't want to have happen, and certainly not one that we want to encourage. So there's problems around there. If we took it away from that and thought instead about a light observer force of UN blue helmets, so not a rapid reaction force that needs NATO, but light observer forces that Bangladeshis, Nepalis, Pakistanis, Indians could put on the ground. Of course, the problem with that is there has to be some kind of peace to keep. And we saw in the mid-1990s, when one or both parties aren't interested in that kind of UN intervention can do nothing. We saw that, we saw the removal of UN forces in Rwanda. We saw the inability of UN forces in Bosnia, notably Srebrenica. We've seen the mess in Somalia in 1991-92. So for a light UN intervention force, that depends on there being some will on the party's side not to continue the war. Otherwise, those UN forces simply become casualties. And it's not likely, once the invasion seemed likely to happen, it's not likely that Bangladesh or Pakistan or others would volunteer to put their troops in the way, on the border. And again, unfortunately, doing those things comes back to that has to be approved by the UN Security Council. And guess which country wouldn't allow that to happen? So
that wouldn't have happened anyway.
It wouldn't have happened anyway, which is not the same as saying that Guterres and the Secretary General's office could not have established on their own merit a special political and put a special representative of the Secretary General and his or her staff into that area. So the Secretary General's office could have been more proactive. Of course, hindsight, they weren't. I think there were opportunities for political efforts and they might well have failed, but be willing to fail, be seen to have tried, and be willing to fail, because that process might also, in a sense, demonstrate who is the aggressor here. So I think there were missed opportunities, unfortunately.
Okay,
I was wondering, Meta.
Yes.
Okay, so you can hear me because my iPhone seems to be acting up. It says safe driving mode, and I'm not sure if the video's on, but no. At least you can hear me.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead and speak, because we were wondering whether you'd just taken a coffee break or.
No. I think it's the iPhone acting up. It says I'm driving, but I'm behind a desk.
Okay.
So very peculiar.
Okay.
But having said that, there was something that you said that I thought needs a little more attention. When you said that and I'm sure it's happening, but it needs to happen in a more public way. And that's India and China. And zeroing in on those 35 countries, something Erica mentioned, I believe it was Erica mentioned. And there's something that I think globally has been missed. When I said that Putin has framed this discussion and framed it around NATO, etc., this actually, there are global repercussions besides the a global rules-based order. There's and the endless conversations about Russian gas and whether the Germans, will have to use less air conditioning in the summer, etc. There's a much greater threat. Ukraine, and people are starting to wake up to this. Ukraine used to be known as the breadbasket of Europe, but currently it's a key exporter of agricultural commodities to the world, and especially into regions that are both politically unstable and food insecure. Just some numbers, I might get the numbers somewhat wrong off the top of my head, but about 32 or 34% of the caloric intake in Lebanon comes from Ukrainian food sources. Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Bangladesh was mentioned. Bangladesh, all of those countries range between 20 and 40% of their wheat comes from Ukraine. 80% of Ukraine's agricultural exports go through the port of Odessa. And one thing that the UN should be doing, and I had great hopes that Canada would champion this, was that we would look beyond the sort of Eurocentric approach to all of this and constant flights across the Atlantic to Europe. And we'd spend some more time talking to these countries that by the fall, we may be seeing on our front pages of newspapers, or I guess on the internet, photos of horrific atrocities committed in Ukraine next to photos of children with distended bellies in these food vulnerable regions of the world. And the UN could, and when you look at the voting patterns, the UN could play a role in designating the port of Odessa, for instance, as critical infrastructure for global food security.
What's the threat? Isn't that a brilliant idea? If you can say, don't do it or else. Now, what is the or else going to be?
So here's part of it. I remember, I referenced earlier when I was in Darfur, what was fascinating there, on a very, very different scale, of course, and without the nuclear threat that keeps being strategically repeated. But, I dedicated so much of my time working on finding ways to peacefully resolve issues before they spiraled out of control. But one thing I saw in Darfur was the death rates, how they plummeted when Canada sent in, I think they were called bisons, and they had, they had tremendous firepower. And I, once again, could get the numbers wrong, but from, I think the peak was 12,000 people in certain regions per week that were being killed. It dropped to several thousand just because of the presence of those bisons. And instead of a NATO naval presence, and then, of course, we have the issue of Turkey and the Bosphorus, the Montreux Convention. But once again, this is where you need a general secretary pulling people in, talking with them, going to India, going to China, going to Bangladesh, frankly, going to Egypt and discussing these issues. So it's unfortunate Guterres doesn't have the cachet that previous secretary generals have had. But I still believe there is this opportunity of, and the key might be global food security, because we just have to go back to the Arab Spring. There were multiple factors there, but one of them was the rise in wheat prices that triggered, a series of revolutions.
You're speaking as if Putin has some moral conscience, that you can speak to this man and say, you can't starve the whole world, damn it. Stop this nonsense, because look what you're doing. And I don't think it's going to make any difference. The question is, if somebody has leverage over him and he understands power. Now, I don't think, I mean, China has some, apparently. I don't think they're very willing to use it. But I don't think Modi has a lot. He's buying weapons from Russia, but I don't think Russia necessarily cares. But, you know, what kind of incentive could we trade with Putin? No, sorry, with Xi, to say, look, Xi, if you'll do this for us, put some leverage on Putin, we'll do this for you, which is something you've been wanting. The only thing that we came up with Sunday was somebody proposed that Xi had wanted some new innovation to be put forward about regulating the internet a few years ago, and that it was actually a very good proposal. I didn't know about this, and in fact, Powell Meyer says it really wasn't that good. But I won't go into the details because I don't understand them. Point is, if this was something she wanted enough, maybe we could go and say, okay, we'll go with this, whatever, this other deal that you want, and it might be the internet regulation. And if you will use all your influence to tell Putin that he has to at least refrain from using tactical nuclear weapons. Think about that.
So, yeah. So when it comes to, and each country, I'm sure there would have to be very customized approaches to those discussions. But with China, China takes a longer view of these things. And the discussions should probably be something along the lines, do you really want to see this spiral to a point where there's a bipolar world economically, where you're tied in with Russia, but blocked out where you do most of your trade and where most of your profits come from?
I'm going to interrupt you, Boris, just for a second, because I do think the Chinese have thought that through. They know that there's a long-term impact of this war, and that's why they're restraining themselves. They did abstain and vote. You know, they're not strong supporters of Putin. They're not out there doing lots of things to boost Putin's morale. So I don't think we should talk down to the Chinese and say, hey, you need to be aware of the long-term future game that we're playing here. But what the West needs to do is to institute Marshall Plan 2.0. So Boris Johnson has advocated that idea. I wrote an article in the Hill Times with my brother, Mike Simpson, who works on the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN. And that concept is to return to an idea from World War II, in the wake of World War II, where the United States and European powers promised to help Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, well known. The New York Times has covered this for months now, that Yemen and Bangladesh are going to starve this coming winter and so on. We all know that, and that is why we need a Marshall Plan 2.0, so that the Ukrainians know that we will, for every brick that fell, we will build 5 more, and it will be sustainable. We will have energy sources that are not nuclear, that will be solar, wind, hydro, etc. And we will pour billions of dollars, not in armaments, purely armaments, but in new ways, so that the Ukraine is built back up again. And that's the promise that we should be making now, the West. So instead of just focusing on what's wrong with the UN and how we can't do anything, we need a beacon of hope. I think I really want to emphasize that we here in the peace movement really need to bring in some ideas about that will bring people hope. Controlling the internet is a crazy idea. I don't understand how would that affect?
Erica, but no one's arguing against this Marshall Plan 2.0. It's a great idea, but in the meantime, how many dead Ukrainians are we willing to stomach? Is it, we're not sure what the numbers are currently, but it's probably somewhere around 40, 50,000.
How many dead Russians are we willing to stomach?
Is it 500,000?
As a Russian mother,
is it 1 million? Is it 5 million? Mm-hmm. And what do we do to stop the killing?
Yeah.
And
sure.
What are the opportunities out there to stop the killing? And it's not a matter of talking down to the Chinese and assuming they haven't thought this through. They have. But it's back to Meta's point. We need to see those visits, that respect paid to them, that we're talking about this. it can't be a situation where China has more bilaterals with Russia than they do with the countries where they actually do most of their trading. And right now, they are one of the countries that would have an impact. India, quite correctly, and I'm sure India, I'm sure, doesn't want to see Bangladesh next door where people are starving to death. So there are various approaches that can take place. And what I was pointing out to was Meta was quite correct, and the UN has the capacity. You just look at how the votes landed. Ignore the Security Council and the way it's structured and the veto. But I was there and I was talking with different delegations. They're looking for a way to become more activist. So can we somehow, and at the end of the day, Canada, what is Canada's role? We're Canadians. What is our role? Lester B. Pearson was referenced earlier. What an incredible role we were able to play. The responsibility to protect was talked about somewhat. That's unfortunately out of the gate, but the actual principle, how it was formulated, and Alistair was quite correct, precludes certain actions, but the actual thinking behind it, the prevention of those genocide. And how do you prevent genocide while it's already taking place? And let's be clear, we are watching a genocide.
You bet.
What happened in Mariupol is genocide. It's another Srebrenica. The mass graves are there, and we'll see more of them when it's deoccupied. So the question is, what can we do? And I think one of those, there are various ways. There's always 10 different ways that if we really put our minds to it, that we can approach this. And then what is Canada's role in the midst of this? Can we have a role? And I frankly believe that we can, because we have in the past.
We certainly are on the right track, looking for the kinds of answers, what we can do. But we're 5 minutes over time. So thank you all. I wish we could continue this, and we might come up with a real winning solution, but you can each work on it separately and let me know if you come up with a brilliant idea. Thank you all. It's been
Thank you, Meta.
Stimulating and extremely important. Okay. Take care. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. And this is episode 441. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, look around, because we have conversations going on there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show with other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. I'll see you there.